Redefining sustainability based on the cognitive paradigm of indigenous cultures. So the presentation actually looks at sustainability from a very different perspective. The word sustainability doesn't exist in, in indigenous cultures. It's a clearly an anthropocentric terminology created by people who made life unsustainable. So I think it's very important to look at how indigenous communities have been able to keep sustainability alive without ever addressing that, as if it is part of their biological makeup to be sustainable. Some redefinitions are called for at this point in time. So sustainability is understood as a natural intent of life to sustain life and not as an anthropocentric idea. And cognitive paradigm is the condition of the formation of one's total beingness. Indigeneity need to be understood as a cognitive category, a way of knowing and being, contextual, experiential, process-oriented, and trusting life. A feeling of abundance is inbuilt into them. They are present and in timelessness. And hence, sustainability is a way of being. It's an existential fact. It's absolutely natural to the cognitive conditions of an indigenous culture. Modernity is another cognitive category, decontextualized, non-experiential, product-oriented, and distrusting life. Naturally, there's a feeling of lackness, and they are physically present, mentally absent. That is the way normally an anthropocentric person is. And sustainability is an afterthought, and that too a very selfish idea, self-centered, because it looks at only from a very narrow perspective of how I should be sustainable, my company, my nation. The whole life is not encompassed, and sustainability without looking at the totality of life is absolutely a failed idea completely. So indigeneity and modernity are two cognitive paradigms, or we could say two formative conditions. One produces nature-centric people who are by nature sustainable, and the other is anthropocentric people who in almost everything they do, they live in a very unsustainable manner. So how did the shift from indigeneity to modernity happen? So this is actually the key thing to understand, and to even while looking at what are the benefits that modernity has created, it is worthwhile to relook at what are the conditions within indigeneity that did not turn against life at all. So one of the key factor that made the shift in the formation of modern human beings is the printing press, because it actually creates a new kind of cognitive condition. It changes the content of learning itself totally. The total system is changed because your cognitive source is the word, the printed word. The process is reading, reasoning. So there is a complete shift that printing press brought about into the way that modern human beings have been formed. In fact, modernity also can be told as or defined as the beingness that got formed due to mediated knowing. So it's very clear that literates learn the word, illiterates learn the world. But learning is a two-way process, because the literates are shaped by the word and the illiterates are shaped by the world. So it's important to look at how does the brain architecture get built in the whole process. The operating system of the literates are shaped by the written word. Reading, reasoning, agreeing, disagreeing, more reading, more thoughts. And because it is second hand, what one does is to have permutation combination of the linguistic inputs, whereas the operating system of the illiterates are shaped by the world they experience. And it's a very simple, effortless act of sensing, feeling, knowing, being. So how does modernity create anthropocentric beings? Because all children are born into indigeneity, but the modernity conditions the child to be anthropocentric. See, these words are absent in dictionary of indigenous communities. The vocabulary doesn't have waste, boredom, teaching, learning, sustainability, etc. So waste, I think, is the most important word to look at, because waste could be considered as the production of waste could be considered as the beginning of unsustainability. And clearly this is a anthropocentric creation. But why there is no word waste in the vocabulary of indigenous communities? It may be because they are nature centric, and in nature there is no waste at all, because nature exists in the mode of regeneration, recreation and recycling. And naturally the nature centric people also imbibe these qualities. But what have we done in the modern context? We have just kept a waste paper basket, and just because of that the children learn how to waste. Just a simple product can shape our beingness. So it's very important to look at the language that we have evolved within the context of modernity, because this language is fundamentally responsible for, apart from the way we live, the formation of our beingness. And as we discussed earlier, the literacy has changed us in a very deep manner. The very nature of language changes from oral to visual. More than that, the quality of language. See, one is a very experiential language. The body can understand that, whereas the other is conceptual language. Is the mind created language, disconnecting from experience. And other impact is that it creates a new space in the brain to store conceptual information. See, this is not a natural thing that happened. This was forced onto our system to accommodate a new way of being. Naturally it has changes completely. It has fragmented our body and mind, because the body senses are not required in the act of reading and making illusions about understanding that. So naturally it numbs the senses. It totally denies the other right brain activities. In fact, it functions in a more fragmented manner. So language takes on a very different quality, because the experiential language is holistic language. It uses both sides of the brain. But the modern language is one-sided. It's a very right brain kind of it's a very reasoning oriented language. And also it has turned, the literacy has turned knowledge into a product. So clearly these are two types of cognitive systems. The literates and illiterates have very, very different kinds of, the total cognitive system is different. So we can look at starting from the source. What is the source of a illiterate? It's the world, whereas for the literates it's the word. The content is contextual for illiterates and decontextualized for the literates. Tools are senses, body, mind, and for literates it's only the mind. And the eye is also used as a mental tool. And the process for illiterates is experiencing, whereas for literates it's reading. And the foundation, the cognitive foundation that gets built primarily is by sensory inputs, on which linguistic inputs take place in the illiterates, whereas in the literate world the sensory inputs are completely neglected, and purely linguistic inputs are given, and that forms the basis for the cognitive foundation. And the method is learning and absorbing for illiterates, more like absorbing, whereas for the literates teaching is the fundamental shift that took place, because with ready-made knowledge what you do is to teach, and knowledge itself, illiterates are continuously in a creative mode, but they recreate probably the same language, but the same knowledge, but there is an act of recreation that happens, whereas in modernity it's a transfer of knowledge that takes place, and comprehension is through self-organization, whereas for literates it is through reasoning. And the content is unknown for literates because there is no ready-made knowledge, whereas for the literates it begins with in the realm of known, due to the fact that we are dealing with ready-made knowledge. And the nature of content for the illiterate, it's very dynamic, alive, because you're dealing with the real world. Whereas for the literates, they are dealing with a static, dead, ready-made, organized material. And naturally, the impact onto the cognitive system is that, in the cognitive possibility within the being is that, amongst the illiterates, the inherent ability to learn gets awakened. What is natural in us gets awakened, because that is what happens to all the living beings. Whereas for literates, there is a new activity that takes place which actually conditions our brain, our cognitive system completely. So the shift from world to the word, the fundamental shift is we move from the realm of unknown to the known. And from learning as an autonomous activity, being taught, which also was creating dependency. Fragmentation of the body and mind, denial of living aspect of knowing, the biological aspect of learning, disappearance of feminine, or the the other quality, and preoccupation with permanence and certainty, fear of unknown leading to fear of tomorrow. What prevents the modern human beings from learning from the illiterates? This is another tragedy, because in a catch-22 situation, the literates are trapped in some way unless they are truly willing to re-examine everything. So there is a feeling of superiority inbuilt, instilled subconsciously due to the feeling of being educated, developed, progressed, evolved. And each word that modernity creates this kind of binary and hierarchy. So modernity has completely misunderstood children, knowledge creation process, what constitutes knowledge, and the very process called living. All this is because they shifted their cognitive source from the real world to the miniaturized, decontextualized world communities. And process orientation means life is a process, so is the child. But getting children to store knowledge as product totally takes out learning as a biological process. And of course, there is a fight between nature and nurture typical of modernity. But this should be understood that a true meaning of or definition of culture is the balance, when it establishes balance between nature and nurture. And we should replace the word culture with engineer for modern conditions, because modernity basically, where the nurture dominates and almost denies nature, creates a very engineered human being. So how do we engineer children? There are two things that are impacting children's development. One is that the cognitive autonomy, or I would call the cognitive right of the child, is completely denied due to our feeling that they need to be taught, instructed, helped. And second is that they are being misled from the real world into its description, which is often distorted, compartmentalized, fragmented, simplified, miniaturized. And this is also done through not just books, but the kind of toys. That's another major misunderstanding that we have done. Creation of toys for children, because children doesn't need toy at all. Unknown is the most important thing to be understood, because non-literate indigenous communities provide unknown as the primary context for the development of children. Unknown as the condition shapes the value system based on humility and wonder. It develops the cognitive system based on senses, body, and real world experience, which also enables presence. And no teaching is another condition, and that condition develops the value system based on respect, collaboration, and openness, and the cognitive system based on playful exploration and discovery. Because in the realm of unknown, the only thing you can do is to explore. And this also establishes the cardinal biological principle of autonomy and autopoiesis. So the biggest paradox of modernity is that the scientists from MIT and various other institutions are now learning how and what children learn autonomously, but basically to produce artificial intelligence, because they are now thinking of creating autonomously learning machines. And this is never to be used for creating a space for children, but the same AI is being used to dumb children down by teaching them ABCD and all this distorted versions called what we call as knowledge. Knowing is the nature of life. Why one learns is to sustain life. What is learned is species dependent. What each species learns is context dependent. Where and when is the context? The context dictates what to learn. Content dictates how to learn. The regulatory mechanism within life ensures the continuation of life. Thank you very much. Existential Knowledge Foundation. Please visit us to see a completely different kind of exploration we are on to.